Hi everyone, are you all able to hear me till the back? Okay, great. Good to see all of you. The way we're going to do this is we're going to have about 30 minutes of a conversation on stage, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. So we will leave a good 30-minute chunk for your questions. So don't worry, a lot of you will get a chance to speak. I'm sure that this subject invites strong opinions, quite understandably so, as long as we keep it civil. No question is off the table. There could not be a more timely context for this conversation with three very distinguished gentlemen and among the top three finest minds on strategic affairs in India. And I don't know how many of you know that in a couple of hours from now, the American president, Donald Trump, will be meeting with the Pakistan Army Chief, Asim Munir. So this is a really sort of good context for us to have this conversation. Another important bit of information to set the stage is that Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump spoke on the telephone earlier today, and President Trump asked the Prime Minister to come to Washington to meet him. The Prime Minister cited prior commitments, so basically said thank you but no thank you. But underlined the fact that India, and I'm quoting the sort of official statement from the Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri here, underlined the fact that India has never accepted mediation and never will. This is in the context of Trump now, I think 10 or 12 or 13, I've even lost count, times claiming credit for having brought a halt in hostilities between India and Pakistan in Operation Sindoor. So with that context set, I will actually start with you, Ambassador Raghavan, if I may. Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand the difference between back channel and mediation. But what happens is diplomats understand it. A lot of people in the general public do not. And so when this announcement came by Donald Trump on the 10th of May, when I remember being in Jammu that day and waking up in my hotel at 5 a.m. to the sound of drones that had been intercepted over residential colonies, over a temple complex, a missile intercepted near Delhi. That was the morning that felt that the war was climaxing. It was actually increasing in intensity. And that's the evening that suddenly, it looked sudden to the general public, Donald Trump makes this announcement before Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri can. From then to now, and Trump's imminent meeting with the Pakistan Army Chief, how do you read it? What's going on?
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you very much, Kurum, for inviting me and giving me a chance to come again and interact with so many friends here. Now, the first point about the difference between back channel and mediation, and Trump doesn't get the difference, it is a very, very subtle distinction. Because, and it's often something people don't get. Diplomats sometimes get it, but it is, as I said, a very fine distinction, and it's easy to say that what is really the difference, because the fact is that you do want American intervention, or you did want American intervention for giving the de-escalation process traction. So it's not as if...
Explain that, because people here were going to say, then that's a ceasefire, that's a mediation.
Well, yes, but you did want them to be involved so that you could de-escalate or reach a ceasefire. And it's not as if this is the first time they've done it. They did it during Kargil. They've done it on earlier occasions too. Because in the end, you don't want to go up the escalation ladder with Pakistan. So you do want external people coming in to calm things down, to de-escalate once you have realized your objectives. At the same time, you don't want them to play a more permanent role. So there is a distinction between that you want them to calm things down, but you don't want them to mediate in anything more structural. And as I said, it's a subtle distinction, because people can get impatient that you're bringing us in all the time to calm things down, then how come we can't stay and continue to calm things down? So I think that really is the situation. So I don't think we should immediately assume that outsiders will not see a role for themselves. Because if you are unable to attend to problems with your neighbors, and you want outsiders to come in to stop things from getting out of control, and at the same time you don't want them to play a more prominent role, you also have to attend to that contradiction.
But are the outsiders coming in at your behest or on their own sort of concern about the old familiar trope, the dangers of a nuclear war?
I think a mixture of both, and perhaps there'll be much greater weightage about their own concerns about a nuclear flashpoint. But outsiders are concerned, it's a fact of life. And their point is that, look, if you can't attend to your neighborhood yourself, but you also don't want us to come in, then what exactly is your game plan? And that is really the issue which we have to address.
So let me pick up this last statement and take it to Ambassador Sood. This idea that India can't attend to the neighborhood, in this case Pakistan, there are actually no good options with a country that has basically unleashed an asymmetric war using terrorism as its instrument. If you don't take kinetic action, as we did not after 26/11, though David Cameron, by the way, talking about outside powers in his memoirs, does say that Manmohan Singh at that time said another strike and we'll take kinetic action. And Cameron was working the phones at that time, I know, to both countries. But if you don't take kinetic action, then the people feel our government didn't do anything. And if you do, you have countries calling you and saying, stand down.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Barkha, and my thanks also to Quorum for inviting me with my old colleagues and friends on this panel. One additional thing that I would make is that back channel normally is confidential. Trump can be anything but confidential. Right. So, I mean, he is not really suited to be a back channel. The second thing, to come to your question and to build a little bit on what Raghavan said, you know, there are two competing narratives. What we would like, our narrative is that you cannot equate Pakistan, which is the perpetrator of terrorism, with India, which is the victim of terrorism. Yeah. And we would like the world to accept that narrative. Now, Pakistan, on the other hand, also would like to claim that, look, we are trying to help, but if India is going to attack us, then we are also a nuclear weapon state. Now, the moment that word nuclear, when the nuclear card gets flashed, or even otherwise, the rest of the world gets more exercised. Between the two narratives, one may be important, but the other assumes urgency. And so, because of that, you get external intervention. Because, as Raghavan said, neither side wants to escalate, but they don't know how to de-escalate. Because de-escalation requires what? De-escalation requires that both sides need a face-saving exit. And if you think about it, in the case of 2016, the surgical strikes, you know, we announced in the morning that this morning we carried out surgical strikes across the line of control, and so many terrorist launch pads were demolished, and so many terrorists were killed, and all the rest of it. And the Pakistanis said, well, nothing happened really. And after a day or two, they took their journalists up to that point that we claimed. And they said, look, where's the evidence? So both sides had, you know, we claimed our own. There was a movie called Uri, and so on. And the Pakistanis claimed that nothing had happened. When it came to Balakot, things got complicated because one of our aircraft got shot down. Wing Commander Abhinandan Kumar, he was, you know, he landed in Pakistan, was in Pakistani custody. And it was the Americans who then, again, in the same manner, Trump tweeted from Hanoi at that point, saying that you will be hearing good news very soon. And so we claimed victory in the sense that we said we had attacked Balakot and we ensured that our pilot was returned to us safely. The Pakistanis claimed victory because they said we showed the Indians that we could take care of our air force is superior to theirs or whatever. And we are warm, good-hearted people, so we, as a humanitarian gesture, we returned the pilot to them. So both sides went away happy. But this is where you need the face saver for both sides. So if we want to be able to manage it ourselves, then we must find it in ourselves to be able to have communication channels which will offer a face saver to Pakistan. But if we have no communications and we say no talks, nothing, then obviously we will get external intervention. Now, this is the last point, that we need it for de-escalation, but we don't want it for mediation. So
it's a really subtle point that for an elected leader and an elected government, and I'm now talking politically, is very difficult to explain to their voters and to citizens at large. I do get the distinction. Sorry, were you done with your points?
Yeah,
And then okay. So, Ambassador Bisaria, you have the fine distinction of being a sacked High Commissioner from, from Pakistan. For those who don't know, Ajay was basically asked to leave after India abrogated Article 370. But also, you were in the hot seat when the Pulwama terror attack is followed by Balakot and the capture of Abhinandan Varthaman. And you have, all three of you have fine books, and all three of you have captured many of these. And in your books, you've actually spoken about the Prime Minister's public speech at that time, talking about a Qatal ki Raat, indicating kinetic action, and that kind of coercive diplomacy that was being channeled in the background, right? What is the difference between that situation and Sindoor?
Okay, thank you. And thanks again, Quorum, for having me. I would say when we draw the parallel between Pulwama and Pahalgam and see those events, that kind of illustrates the point you've been probing. What happened then as now was that after the Pulwama attack, we had Balakot. And I have made the argument that because of the unexpected development of the pilot being on the Pakistani side, what India said very clearly was there would be 9 missiles or an escalation if the pilot was not returned. So the escalation dynamics took a different turn, and the pilot was returned in 24 hours, unheard of in India-Pakistan relations. Pakistan said it was the goodness of our heart, but it was really the coercive power of the threatened action. And just like in this case, it was primarily the coercive power of the next stage of escalation that India would take, that Pakistan sues for peace or asks for a ceasefire. Now, the interesting distinction is that in Pulwama, we had a situation on the 27th of February after Balakot of the Americans who were then in Hanoi saying that we got, the Pakistanis went to them and said, look, the Indians are going to escalate, 9 missiles might come. And the US and then Secretary Pompeo, they get involved with some diplomacy. So Pompeo says, doesn't tweet real time, but says...
Doesn't have a Truth Social account.
Exactly. Yeah. Says 4 years later in his memoir that was a memorable night. What happened was that I spoke to the Indian leader, in this case it was Sushma Swaraj, the foreign minister, and she said, I'm worried that the Pakistanis are moving their nukes, according to Pompeo. And then he calls up the real leader of Pakistan, as he calls him, General Bajwa, and Bajwa says, no, I'm not moving my nukes, it may be the Indians who are doing it. And then he says that there was a good night of diplomacy by our people on the ground in India and Pakistan, and then we got a deal. Now, the distinction was that no one tweeted, and India claimed what it did, and Pakistan claimed what it did. Now, what made the difference was that it was seen as a largely bilateral affair. So at best, what the Americans did was establish a crisis communication channel or establish a channel of communication or a channel of amplification, and not a channel of mediation, in which case, you know, the mediator has some agency in pushing the two belligerents onto an agreement. So I think that pretty much explains it. Here, it was Trump being Trump, grabbing the credit. You know, his tweet comes at 5:25, whereas the choreographed agreement was that the two sides would do the tweeting. So 5:28, the Pakistani tweet comes in that we asking for a ceasefire. The Indian comes at 5:55, but Trump jumps into this fray at 5:25.
And you think he's actually deliberately wanting to beat the Indians in a fastest finger first sort of moment? Or do you think that was just coincidence that he said it first?
Oh, no, it was definitely a credit grabbing moment because, you know, the context was that Trump said he is the peacemaker, deal maker in chief of the world. He wasn't getting much traction in the two real wars that were happening in Gaza and Ukraine. And therefore, this South Asia seemed like a bonanza. It seemed like a crisis that lands up on his lap.
Yeah.
And when Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, reports to him that, look, we've got a deal, he said, I'm going to take credit. So he takes that credit. So I think that is the way it probably...
But you know, just to again remind everybody that because of Trump going public, it looks to everybody that this is the first time that this has happened. But if you just go back to 26/11 and the Mumbai terror attacks, Ambassador Raghavan, the ISI chief at that point, the Brits got involved in the back channel and they suggested that the ISI chief come to India, and Zardari at that time gives his go-ahead and the Pakistan army basically overrules it. But this is David Miliband basically doing all of this heavy lifting in the back channel, but nobody is tweeting about it. The question is, when these countries get involved in this way, the danger always is a kind of hyphenation in their mind. And India spent a long time disentangling ourselves from this dash relationship with Pakistan. Trump, by going public, has brought that hyphenation back, as if India and Pakistan are actually equivalent entities, which we clearly are not on any objective metric. How do we counter that?
I don't think we can. Because I think, to my mind, hyphenation is an old-fashioned concept. Okay. It emerged in the 70s, 80s, when, in a sense, if you looked at the size of the Indian economy and what was happening in Pakistan, you looked at per capita income, maybe there was some kind of equivalence between the two, but those days are now 30 years in the past. There is actually no hyphenation possible between India and Pakistan, as you said, on the basis of any objective matrix. But when it comes to a military confrontation type of situation with the dangers of escalation, it's just not possible to tell countries that don't look at us as two adversarial combatants or potential combatants.
Why not? The Lashkar-e-Taiba has been a prescribed terror group since 2001, I think, even recognized by the United Kingdom. Why do we keep getting described as a sort of, this is a dispute between India and Pakistan?
Because if the focus is on terrorism, all the countries which concern us would certainly see things from our point of view. But once this focus shifts from terrorism to a military confrontational situation, that perspective changes very quickly. And there's nothing you can do about it, because that is the way perspectives change. During 26/11, because we kept the focus on terrorism, you were able to keep a certain cocktail of countries firmly behind you, putting pressure on Pakistan and making them take some minimal steps which satisfied you. But if it shifts away from focus from terrorism to an adversarial situation, then the nuclear flashpoint thing, it just overrides any other consideration or any other argument which you can make.
Yeah, but Ambassador Sood, how much of this nuclear flashpoint is, you know, since I've been in journalism, which is now 30 years, I've been hearing this phrase nuclear flashpoint. Bill Clinton used it early on when he said Kashmir is one of the most dangerous places, it's a nuclear flashpoint. And even now, it's very interesting that the Chief of Defense Staff actually goes on record to say that there was no nuclear signaling in this conflict of Operation Sindoor. And yet, the entire Western universe talks about the need to end this conflict because of the potential of a nuclear conflict, right? So, till that narrative is used in public discourse, in Western media, in geopolitics, that, oh, these two countries can't actually have a military conflict because it will erupt into a nuclear conflict, will India's kinetic action, military options always be circumscribed by the West?
Well, that's a good point. But the thing is that while there is no comparison in terms of where India's economy is today, India's size, India's potential, India's population, India's defense budget, compared to Pakistan's defense budget, etc., etc. But when it comes to a military conflict, then neither side has the capability actually to achieve a decisive victory. The last decisive victory that India had was 1971, when we were able to, take advantage of the growing disturbances in East Pakistan then, and Bangladesh got created. After that, we have had Kargil. It was a limited conflict. We've had terrorist attacks. We have the Pakistan policy of 1,000 cuts and things like that. But in terms of the military wherewithal, in terms of the force capabilities that we have, the equipment that we have, the nuclear capability that we have, and what Pakistan has, you are more or less even. And the world can see that, because that is not such a secret. I mean, you can't completely denude your China border and bring everything to bear on the Pakistan. It's just not possible. So in that sense, there is the hyphenation willy-nilly comes in with the nuclear flashpoint thesis. Now, it gets aggravated because we have no communication channels. As you know, we had decided long ago to put Pakistan in the doghouse. We said we're not going to talk to Pakistan, and so on and so on. And we have re-emphasized that. We've no trade, no talks. The high commissioners haven't been there since 2019, Ajay. We've cut down the sizes of the missions. We have Indus Waters Treaty has been put in abeyance. Pakistan has said that they are putting the Shimla Agreement in abeyance. And I mean, So if you don't have any communication channels, how do you de-escalate? And that is the problem. And because you are evenly placed militarily, the rest of the world is bound to get energized about it.
So one, the DGMOs do continue to have a hotline, but that is in strictly...
Well, DGMOs are not negotiators.
Agreed. But just saying that even through this Operation Sindoor, apart from whatever international message carrying may have been happening, the DGMOs were talking. But I want to pick up this last point, because though neither Ambassador Sood nor Ambassador Raghavan have said it in so many words, I think what they're saying is that the moment you get into a military conflict, it comes with other problems, right? And the problems then become that the world gets involved. That's the first point. And when the world gets involved, it doesn't always get involved on the terms that you'd want to. But I will ask you slightly a different question. You say that it was actually the threat of possible missiles being sort of unleashed against Pakistan that made them return Wing Commander Abhinandan. Operation Sindoor seems to indicate that it was, nobody knows this for sure, I'm making an estimation here, that it was the devastation of Pakistan's air bases and their air defense that made them switch from announcing their operation against India on Saturday morning and agreeing to a halt in hostilities by Saturday evening. So do we now have a security doctrine where actually every time there is a terror attack, military response will follow and will have to follow?
No, absolutely yes. That is the new normal. And really speaking, this new doctrine has been evolving since 2016. Because the point we've been making is that terrorism has been with us for decades. Yeah. We saw it in Punjab in the 80s, in Kashmir in the 90s, all over India in the 2000s. But 2016, we made the point that we will take kinetic action against an act of terrorism again in 2019 and solidified this in 2025 by saying we will climb a couple of rungs of the escalatory ladder. But you know, the other point on hyphenation, to just jump back to that, I think the hyphen went away in this relationship, even in the US mind, on the 4th of July 1999. That is the Kargil time. That is the time when Bill Clinton invited Nawaz Sharif to the White House. He was staying at Blair House. Yeah. And he called up Vajpayee and he said, why don't you come along? We'll settle this once and for all. And Vajpayee said, no, thank you. I'm not coming there. But this is the message I want you to give to the Pakistanis. Get the hell out of every inch of Kargil. Get behind the line of control. That is our minimum condition. We are not talking beyond this. And we know, we have accounts of what the Americans did. They really acted as India's advocates. So I would frame even the meeting between Asim Munir and Trump in that context. You know, Trump calls up Modi and says, why don't you drop in also?
Yeah, but can you imagine, hypothetically, what is he thinking? That Prime Minister Modi and the Pakistan Army Chief are going to be in Washington on the same day having bagels? I mean, what's
possibly
the thought?
In his mind, yes, possibly. Because, you know, Trump doesn't represent the views of the United States or even the views of his own administration.
Yeah.
He represents his own views. And those views change periodically. So he might just pick up the phone and say, why don't you drop in? I'm having another guest for lunch. So, you know, this is the way I think he would frame it to himself. But that's not the way India sees it. That's not the way even, I would argue, the United States sees it. It's completely different.
But yet you don't think it's anti-India. You're saying you don't think this meeting between Munir and Trump is something India needs to be concerned about. Because I do want to talk about...
No, India needs to be concerned about it, but it isn't necessarily anti-India. Because it depends on the kind of message you say. If you read out the Riot Act to Asim Munir about stopping terrorism, it may not be an entirely bad thing.
But Ambassador Raghavan, the truth is that Trump, who wanted to be sort of, recognized as the world peacemaker, is probably going to take his country into a new war if he gets involved in Iran. And the feeling is that this meeting with Munir, which is, by the way, close to the press, which is very unusual for Trump, who conducts foreign policy. We saw what happened with Zelensky in full public gaze. The perception is that this is because the Americans want to use Pakistan for the operation against Iran. So Pakistan can make whatever sounds and statements it wants to about solidarity with Iran, but Pakistan is now going to come under pressure to basically allow its territory, air, land, sea, to be used for US-Israel joint operations. So what does that do to the India-US dynamic? Because in the old days, we used to say Pakistan needs, America needs Pakistan for Afghanistan. Now America needs Pakistan for Iran.
True. Well, it's entirely possible that it has to do with Iran, but whatever is the reason, the meeting is very, very unusual. We were just wondering whether there has been a case of a US president hosting a Pakistan chief of army staff for lunch, and we couldn't come up with any precedent. He has certainly hosted chiefs of army staff when they've been president. Musharraf, Zia, Yahya, Ayub Khan, but never, there is a level issue. And even I think with President Trump, levels are important. So it is a very, very unusual meeting. It's entirely possible it's to do with Iran. My own sense is that it can't just be to do with Iran. And certainly Pakistan has been trying to become geopolitically relevant since 2021 when the Americans left. And being without geopolitical relevance is a situation that doesn't suit them. And they'll certainly grab the Iran opportunity if it's offered. But I don't think it can only be just Iran.
So what else could it be?
I think it has a lot to do with India-Pakistan. Because if you see the trajectory of events and statements coming from the US, from the President, from the State Department, from the White House, it's very clear that they see a certain role for themselves in South Asia. So as I said, events have been pushing in this direction. I don't think it is just to do with Iran. I think certainly it will have something to do with India-Pakistan also. What can that be? One doesn't know. But to my mind, to come to the point which Ajay made, there's a huge difference between Clinton and Kargil and Trump now.
And is that difference only going public or is it something else?
No, the difference is more fundamental. The difference is, at that time, Musharraf was seen as a clear saboteur of an India-Pakistan diplomatic process.
That's right.
He was clearly in the doghouse because of Kargil, and Clinton was acting on that basis, that you are sabotaging a process which a lot of countries had thought they had invested in. They may not have, but they certainly felt they had ownership of that process. And there was a general recognition that Musharraf has really badly played this, and he needed to be put in place. I think the absence of India-Pakistan dialogue for a prolonged period of time, and the fact that you have countries with such fundamentally adversarial relations not having any communication or political process makes other countries really concerned. They don't want to be in a situation only of coming in, firefighting, and then exiting because that's what you want. They say that if we have to come in to do firefighting, we are going to stay and try to manage this much better than you can.
Let me just add, I want to jump in and add a theory on why, an additional reason why he might want to have Asim Munir for lunch. And that is terrorism diplomacy, which Pakistan is now trying, which is they have been gradually drip, giving the Americans terrorists. They are getting ISIS, Al-Qaeda people, capturing them, sending them. Trump mentioned it in his State of the Union address.
Yeah.
And you saw the testimony of Kurilla, the CENTCOM chief, who's saying they're spectacular partners, phenomenal partners, they're giving us terrorists. And this is what Pakistan is using the resource it has to advantage. Use your terrorists, which means this is exactly what they were trying in 2012 with Osama bin Laden, fattening him, letting his value go up, to one day trade him for a great reward from the Americans. The Americans preempted that. But now they want to give more terrorists, I believe 10, 15, 20 a month. And the Americans will claim victory that they've managed to get terrorists out. So this is something that they also benefit from.
So Ambassador Sood, in this context, I don't actually, we've always called India, US institutionally strong and strategically deep, etc. I don't know that when our national security interests aren't seen by America in the way that we would prefer, and for transactional reasons, Trump is leaning towards Pakistan, or maybe for reasons of ignorance or whatever, I don't know the reasons. How does that impact the Indo-US relationship? And two, if Iran turns into this sort of long war like Afghanistan did, that actually fundamentally changes the dynamics of, Pakistan being this marginal player, which is how we would like to think of it, of being this marginal non-entity whom we wish we could ignore, if the Americans start propping them up again.
Yes, and I think this is where the point that Raghavan was making becomes extremely important. But before that, let me just unpack one point, because I think, when we're talking of Kargil, when we said that Clinton put Nawaz Sharif very clearly and said, do you know what is happening at home? Do you know what your army is doing?
Yeah.
And put forward satellite photographs to show him, and he said, you will have to get back to the other side of the line of control. There was hyphenation, but hyphenation did not mean that both sides, or both India and Pakistan, were being treated as equals. Pakistan was, as he said, in the doghouse because India had been able to convince the US. And for that, I think you would recall, there was a very strong dialogue and a relationship that had been built between Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot. And that played an enormous role in that, in helping.
It was called the longest foreplay in diplomacy.
Well, yes, but it delivered, because what it meant was that US saw it from India's standpoint. and the US delivered. So there was hyphenation, but both sides were not seen as equals. Similarly, in Mumbai, both sides were not seen as equals. In fact, it is in 2008 that the first time on the FATF grey list you had Pakistan, which has now happened 3 times. And now we are trying to see if it can be placed on the grey list a 4th time. We don't know. But if Pakistan actually becomes critical in the war, in US engagement in a war with Iran, where it has to offer them bases like Shamsi, Dalbandin, Jacobabad, etc., which it had done in the past, then there is no grey list for Pakistan. Then it's on a white list.
So what does that do to Indo-US relations?
Well, Indo-US relations will continue, but we will have to find ways. I mean, after all, we have spent nearly 3 decades overcoming the hurdles of Indo-US relations. And there are some advantages that are going for us, even when America was in Afghanistan after 2001 till 2021. And the Pakistanis had this duplicitous game of extracting money from them, giving them access, giving them the routes, land routes and air routes to supply people in Afghanistan. They were also supporting the Taliban, and so they can play this. The Pakistani military is very smart at manipulating its interests vis-a-vis the Pentagon. And if we are going to see the American US military or the Central Command get involved in Iran, then the Pakistanis are on a comfortable wicket. However, even when that thing with Afghanistan was going on, it didn't mean that it is during that time that we were able to conclude our nuclear deal with the US in 2008. So, because the drivers behind the India-US relationship are very fundamental. One is economics, the growing size of the Indian economy. The second is it is a non-ideological India in the sense that it is not seen as pro-Soviet or pro-this or pro-that. And the third is the growing political power of the Indian diaspora. So these are the 3 fundamental drivers of India-US relations which make themselves felt in the 1990s and have continued to grow in power since then.
Okay, I need to open this up, but very quickly from all 3 of you. The old cliche used to be a stable Pakistan is in India's best interest. Does that still hold?
You know, I would say a stable Pakistan or unstable Pakistan is not in our control. So I think it's purely
meaningless to think about
a meaningless debate. But on the other point about the Americans courting Pakistan, Americans needing Pakistan, I would make the contrarian argument that it's not necessarily bad for India that Pakistan gets integrated or dependent on Western structures. The alternative
compared to China,
of Pakistan being a complete vassal state of China will mean that it has no oversight from the Western powers. For instance, the $7 billion loan that it got from the IMF, if the Chinese had dished it out, you wouldn't have conditionalities, you wouldn't have the FATF kind of situation. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but Pakistan games it beyond a point. So our talking point with the US used to be, and now again should be, oh, you will need them on the western borders to do various stuff, but don't forget the eastern border, don't give them a free pass, because that is what the Pakistanis will look.
So I'm glad you brought up China, because we haven't spoken about China. And it's quite interesting that our rapprochement begins with China at a time when it looks like there's this big trade war between Trump and the Chinese, but almost everybody is forecasting that Trump will cut a deal. Now what happens if America does enter this Iran conflict on the side of Israel? How is India walking this trapeze, this rope?
I think the indications are we'll try to stay out of it. And we'll try to stay out of it because I don't know how to put it, but I think the feeling will be that this is beyond not beyond our pay grade. But I think the point is where Pakistan is concerned or China is concerned, we have to really be very, very realistic. I mean, this question of whether Pakistan, stable Pakistan, is that in our interest or not, I agree with Ajay. It's not in our power to bring about a stable or unstable Pakistan. But more importantly, it's a no-brainer. If you have a country with which you have deeply adversarial relations, that country is dysfunctional and fundamentally unstable, you obviously don't want a Sudan type of situation. I mean, can you imagine if there were two rival factions in Pakistan battling it out and you're wondering who has the nukes? It's a nightmare situation for us.
But can I interject there? The nature of war in Operation Sindoor, in the air war, what really struck me was tomorrow again not to fearmonger, but if a Lashkar and a Jaish start using drones against India, now do we look at them as Pakistani army assets, which is how I would look at them, or would you look at them as characters gone rogue? Like, is Pakistan really as centered as you're assuming right now or suggesting right now?
You see, there's no answer to these questions, but certainly one point which common sense tells you, that if you have to attend to extremism, radicalism, terrorism in Pakistan, your best instrument has to be the Pakistan military. That's what other countries do. They reach deals with the Pakistan military to deal with terrorists.
But we don't do that.
We don't do that. But because we treat the two as the same.
Right.
But I do think we need to think much beyond that, because this is not a problem which is going to go away. By saying that I will treat Pakistan as one undifferentiated entity, I'm not sure how that amounts to a longer-term policy.
So, Ambassador Sood, before the audience comes in, I don't think that there is, never say never, but I don't think in the near future you are going to see any sort of channeling front or back with Pakistan. I don't know. I'm imagining it's unlikely, but if it were to resume, should that contact and that dialogue then be with the Pakistan military? Like, how long are we going to keep talking to people who have no power?
I think, okay, let me take a different example to illustrate what I'm going to say. You know, we had Galwan in 2020. Now, you yourself were talking about a kind of a rapprochement. We are looking at a possible meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping at the next summit. We have had, so between 2020 and now, when we think that there is a thaw, it's not as if our boundary situation has been resolved. Our chaps both sides have about 50, 60,000 soldiers across the line of actual control in Aksai Chin, face to face and all of that. But between then and now, we've had 25 rounds of talks between the corps commanders.
Right.
We have had 3 rounds of talks between the foreign ministers, or maybe 4, between Wang Yi and Dr. Jaishankar. We have had 2 rounds of talks between the national security advisors and his counterpart, this other special representative, which is also Wang Yi in this particular case, because he wears 2 hats. We have also had 2 fleeting interactions, one in Johannesburg and one in Bali, between the Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, which was, some said it was an exchange of pleasantries, some said something else. There were different versions that were given out. So in a sense, you see that you did not cut out dialogue. Now, China is also an adversarial relationship. Pakistan, why do we have a different adversarial relationship with Pakistan? That we want to cut off dialogue. That, I think, is a question that we all need to reflect on. And which brings me back to what I said earlier, that if you don't have communication, somebody else is going to get worried. And somebody else is going to say, hang on, since you guys are not talking to each other, let me try and sort out. Because if you start throwing nukes at each other, it's bad for everybody.
So basically, you're saying you need to resume some sort of dialogue. Both of you are saying that. I don't know that you're saying that.
I've been saying that, and I've said
Okay.
that in my book as well, that it ought to be a two-track policy, tough on terrorism, calibrated engagement, including with the Pakistan military.
Okay. Let's open this up now. That was riveting. We could go on for hours, but I'm sure a lot of you have thoughts, questions. Okay, that's a lot of hands. So I'm going to just request someone to get a mic to somebody.
I've got a mic.
Yeah,
Just
you do. Okay,
limited to questions, not commentary, if that's okay.
preferably.
Yeah, all right.
Yes. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you think that in hindsight, a military maneuver like Operation Sindoor was a mistake because we seem to have lost our moral high ground, which people like Jaswant Singh and Manmohan Singh took a lot of effort to cultivate?
I'll put that to you because I think you suggested that the cost of military action is that the world starts seeing it as a story of a conflict as opposed to an account of terrorism. But then is the answer to do nothing?
You see, with Pakistan, you choose always from a menu of bad options. There's no good option. It's not as if you're going to get a policy which is perfect. It's not going to happen. The fact is you needed to do something because the nature of that terrorist outrage was such that domestic opinion in India would not be satisfied with measures you had taken. You did take very, very major diplomatic steps, the most important of which was keeping the Indus Waters Treaty in abeyance. It's a huge, huge step, but it had no impact on public opinion, public sentiment. And therefore, it doesn't assuage because
Also because it's very difficult to understand and a lot of people saw it as symbolic and not something you could execute immediately.
I think maybe it should have been announced not so quickly. We could have built it up because it was a huge step, but it passed by almost unnoticed in India. In Pakistan, the impact was huge, and perhaps the impact in many ways is much more than the military action you took. But I do think that when an outrage like Pahalgam happens, you can't do nothing.
And I would agree, but I don't know if any of you have differing opinions.
I'm just going to add to that, it's not only about assuaging public opinion. It is more about setting up deterrence. You know, the issue is that when you have an act of terrorism, how do you make policy that ensures that you don't have another act of terrorism? By doing two things, may not be perfect. One, setting up deterrence against it happening again. And second, by escalating at least the cost of this action. Because the whole idea was that for the last 40 years, it was a low-cost option for Pakistan. Suddenly, the cost has gone up. So if I'm the army general planning another outrage in Kashmir with 25 dead, I have to be ready for 11 bases to be knocked off.
That's right. And can I add a question there? You know, in the past, we had coercive diplomacy and the military on standby. Right? So if you look at an Operation Parakram, which is the mobilization that takes place after the attack on Parliament, more people die in the demining, more of our soldiers die in the demining, we never actually cross the line of control. This time, would you say that something flipped here, where it was the military drawing the red lines, and the diplomacy then having to message it?
Well, first of all, I agree with you, but then the kinetic action that we take, the military retaliation that we exercise, has to depend on the capabilities. Now, what did we have this time? Rafale? When did we start acquiring the Rafales? 2021 and onwards. We also had the Scalp missiles, again 2021 and onwards. We had some of the drones that we used, the Sky Striker. 2022 was when the order was placed for these. So what I'm saying is...
you had the BrahMos, the SR-400.
The BrahMos, the BrahMos is the only one. And the Akash integration, what we call the Akash Tir, the integration of the air defense, is something that has only been achieved in 2023. So let us look at how the military capabilities have grown since 2019 when we had Mirage 2000s and spice bombs, the guided munitions, which we used for Balakot. So it is a question of what your capabilities are in that sense. And I think that is important. Now, when it comes to deterrence, and I think the question was, I don't know about the moral high ground or not, but let me just say, deterrence consists of two parts. You deter by denial, by denying the adversary that he or she can get away with the action. Let me put it to you like this. In the case of Pulwama, let us say if our intelligence had been superior, let us say if our security had been more alert and we had guys there, let us say if instead of 26, say 4 people had died, and let us say instead of 4 terrorists, 2 had been killed there and maybe 1 had been captured, would it have had the same impact? The answer is no. Why? Because our deterrence by denial would have been successful. Okay. Not entirely. Entire success would mean that we had got advanced intelligence about the possibility of the attack and had, nipped the attack before it happened. That would have been perfect. But still, it was deterrence by denial. The second element of deterrence is deterrence by punishment. That means that you inflict such a heavy cost when deterrence by denial has failed, you inflict such a heavy cost that the other person has to think 100 times over before repeating something like that.
But isn't that what happened this time?
No.
Why?
I mean, I will ask, it's a simple thing. Do we think that the terrorist infrastructure will not be rebuilt?
No, it will be.
It will be, all right. Do we think that the Pakistan army has paid such a heavy price that it will cut its links with the likes of Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed and the other groups? No. So then how have we ensured that there may not be another attack? So has deterrence by punishment been adequate?
No, but it's
I
what
don't
Ajay,
know.
it's what Ajay said that they will have to. They will
Perhaps.
have to factor in.
They will have to
They will have
factor
to
in.
factor
The
in.
cost has gone
The
up.
cost has gone up. But
Yes.
the cost will always keep going up, because remember when Prime Minister Modi addressed the nation on 12th,
12th May.
after Op Sindoor, and he said
Yeah.
phase 1 and so on, he made a couple of points there, and he said every act of terrorism will be an act of war. It's a very big statement. Then he went on to say we will not succumb to nuclear blackmail, which Ajay also said, so we're prepared to go up a couple of notches on the escalation ladder. And then he said, no talks, no terror and trade, no terror and talks, no water and blood, and all of that. So given that, and given the fact that we are expanding the envelope from, let us say, surgical strikes to Balakot to now, see, this is human expectation. The next time there is a terrorist attack, which claims, let's say, 15, 20 lives, innocent lives, the call, the expectation of military retaliation will be greater and greater.
My question, and I won't take the answer immediately so we can get more questions, what is the alternative? Yes, I get the menu of bad options, but what is the alternative?
No, I'm not saying there is no alternative. I'm just saying you need to have multiple, because the military option should not be the only option that you exercise. And there, I think all three of us are on the same page.
Okay. We can take another question. Yeah.
Right. Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Thank
Let's
you,
take
sir.
2 or 3 together,
Right, okay.
maybe. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
So I'm Captain Sharad Gautam. So lovely evening. Thank you so much. Now there's steering away a wee bit, not too far. We have a great, well, not say great, but we are building our equation with Afghanistan. And there's a certain Baluchistan which is playing a little teeny-weeny role there. So can we shed some more light on what that equation is? And is it strong enough for us to see a maybe counter to, may not be a China completely, but
Yeah,
know,
it's an
you
interesting
get
question, but
what's-
can I take one more question? Maybe the young girl in front there? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to take the conversation back to when we talked about the meeting between Munir and Trump later today. I couldn't help but wonder, since you talked about how both of them are not exactly on the same level, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe this signals that Trump sees Munir as a more equal counterpart as compared to Shehbaz Sharif.
Right. Those are, one more, I'll take one more, maybe there at the back. Yeah?
Hello.
You have a mic, we can hear you. आप बोलो, मुझे सुनाई दे रहा है, बोलिए.
There are media reports that this has been orchestrated by Sajid Tarrar. Okay, so who is like, so the moot point was, is this meeting really good for Pakistan? Because what we're learning to hear is that this meeting can well be a pro for India as well, because it opens up, because if you have to talk to the army general in Pakistan, there has to be some open channel which India cannot exercise. So is it a way where by some stretch of imagination, India has links to the army chief there, and which is very important?
Okay, I think those are three interesting questions. Why don't you three pick up one each? Ambassador Raghavan.
I think in India we have this wrong notion that we don't talk to the Pakistan army.
Yeah.
We've always been in contact with the Pakistan army. It may not be face to face, but most of the time when you talk to the Pakistan government, you can be pretty sure the answer you get is what the Pakistan army wants, is the answer which it gives. The problem for us arises, not like in today's situation, but the problem for us arises is when the Pakistan military and the Pakistan civilian government are not on the same page, and when they are fighting with each other. And you have no way of addressing that conflict. You have no instrument by which you can patch up between the two. So your problem is the civil-military situation in Pakistan. It's not talking to the Pakistan military. We have always spoken to the Pakistan military.
But never frontally, directly,
No,
formally.
with Musharraf, it was talking
Because
to
he
the
was also president.
But also with civilian governments when they've got along. The problem has always arisen. You see, people think that somehow if we deal with the Pakistan military, there's a magic bullet which we have somehow, not been able to put our hands on.
Yeah.
It's not so. The Pakistan military is the same as the Pakistan government on most issues concerning India. The only difference is that Pakistan politicians are more pragmatic, while Pakistan military are like military officers everywhere. They tend to see things in more securitized terms. It's not as if you're going to make more progress if you talk to the general and not to somebody else. The way forward is to talk to both of them, which is what you try to do.
Okay, on the point of the Taliban and the Pakistan, Ambassador Sood, if you want to take that.
Well, Baluchistan has always been a troubled area for successive Pakistan governments right from 1947. I mean, for some of you who probably know the history, just take my word for it, because Khan of Kalat, it was supposed to be independent and all the rest of it, and then there's military action. And since that time, now, funnily enough, it is the largest province by area, 45%, am I right? 45% of Pakistan's territory is Baluchistan.
Yeah.
In terms of natural resources, by far the richest. In terms of local population, by far the tiniest. And so what happens is that the people there, the Baluch, have always been disaffected, and there have been successive waves of military action by Rawalpindi against the Baluch to quell the rebels. If you remember, in the month of March, there was a big attack on a train, the Jafar Express.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty significant kind of an attack. The train got hijacked. Most of the passengers, the train was going from Quetta to Peshawar. Most of the passengers on the train were service people, their families, etc., etc. After that, there were a number of statements by Pakistani military, the DG, ISPR, and so on, more or less pointing the finger for that attack on India, saying that Indian intelligence agency had orchestrated it. Well, I mean, Pakistan has now increasingly started asserting that Indians are behind some of the problems and they are providing money or weapons or whatever it is to whether it is the Baluch rebels or the TTP. And I think you mentioned that now that our relations with the Taliban in Kabul are improving. If we start playing that kind of two can play at that game. So I mean, but I don't know where that game takes us. Which brings me to the fact that you can exploit the other fellow's weaknesses, but so can the other fellow. So your weaknesses, you have to deal with it yourself at home.
Yeah. On the Trump meeting.
On the
Munir,
young
you were-
lady's question
yes.
about Trump meeting Munir, does he treat Munir as an equal or as the most powerful guy in Pakistan? Yes, he does. But more importantly, he feels Munir can deliver a bag of goodies which is useful for Trump and which will make Trump look good. He'll come armed with 20 terrorists which he'll gift to Trump. He will be useful for Iran. He'll be useful for China. So, you know, there'll be a bunch of uses. They also have this, the US CENTCOM in particular, has this use of Pakistan's army for what they call over-the-horizon capacities in Afghanistan. If they want to take out terrorists, they get basing rights, they get drone rights, and so on. So all that will make it useful. And on the larger question about dealing with the army, yes, we've been dealing with them all the time. You know, how do you think we got the 2021 ceasefire? I was out in 2019 from Pakistan. We weren't having much of a conversation, but through intelligence channels, we were talking to the Pakistan army, and therefore we got a ceasefire in 2021, which more or less held till very recently. And also, I would agree with Raghavan that it is, the problem arises when there's a civil-military discord. And we saw that in 99 when Vajpayee went, that Musharraf
Lahore
was
was
sulking and angry about it, and we got Kargil soon after the Lahore visit. We saw that when Modi visited in 2015, we got an attack in Pathankot a week after, and some army generals told me at cocktails that, you know, why did Modi come? It was an ambush. We never invited him. It meant that we, the army, are the only ones entitled to invite him. Who the hell are these civilians? How can they even think of doing that?
Right. A question here. So,
I have a simple question on what is the core issue with Pakistan? Suppose we give them Kashmir. Suppose for a minute we say take Kashmir. Do you think this problem will be over? Or is it a fundamental dislike for India that I want to fight them 1,000 cuts, 10,000 cuts, and something new will come in that case?
it's actually an excellent question because, you know, reducing everything to, the core issue is Jammu and Kashmir is an excuse that the Pakistanis would use. I'll get all three of you to respond. Sorry, I'll just take one more question maybe. One more question, anybody? Yes, sir. Here. Yeah.
Given that both of us have nuclear stockpiles, does it sort of almost guarantee that future military conflicts would be limited? Because jahan wo ek threshold se badhega, some Western power will intervene.
Yeah. One more question there. Yeah, near the bar. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to the question Sir asked. There was this speech which went viral some days before Operation Sindoor, where Asim Munir was talking to the Pakistani establishment, and he was spewing venom against India and a particular religion. And that was the same ideology because of which India and Pakistan was partitioned. So if there is a path forward, is it a policy path, a strategic path, or we'll have to solve a basic problem?
Can I take one more question at the back? Right there. Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe a little controversial, but everybody focuses on the Indian government or India's military response. Nobody focuses on responsibility of why the act happened in the first place. So logically, we'd say, listen, we don't want 26 people dead and we don't want a war. So, but there's no talk of responsibility, more of response always. So why is that?
Okay, so is Jammu and Kashmir really Pakistan's only problem? Asim Munir's speech, what about better intelligence? So, you know, can you really stop every terror attack? And there was one more question. Yeah, will all future conflicts be basically limited because the world will step in to stop them? We'll pick up any of these four.
Let me start with the first. You know, I've written a book on this. I talk about this central issue, and my central argument would be that what defines Pakistan and the India-Pakistan problem is Pakistan's identity crisis. It's a foundational identity crisis of being unable to define identity, because in the initial years they did not have the benefit of leadership, strong leadership that helped them define either a constitution or an identity. And we see that problem being expressed to the second question, even today in 2025, when Asim Munir makes a speech and acts like a cross between Jinnah and Zia, because he says that this is the two-nation theory is the most important, which means the central reason why we fight is because you are Hindus, we are Muslims. That is the fundamental two-nation theory argument that he makes. He also makes the, like Ziaul Haq, he tries to go back into a sort of religious identity of Pakistan and tries to say that Kashmir banega Pakistan, it's the jugular vein, which means it's central to the identity. So it is the army, the structural problem India faces is that the army is using ideology and the same ideology of Jinnah and Zia to justify its primacy. And I would argue even Pahalgam, it is using to say that we are the only defenders against this dangerous India because it instigates a war to get strong.
But something we haven't spoken about, which really needs to be mentioned, is the unprecedented revolt, if you want to call it that, protest is the better word, across the Kashmir Valley against what happened in Pahalgam, right? And I do think somewhere we have to acknowledge that in our conversation. Yeah.
Well, I would tend to disagree a bit with what Ajay said. I think Kashmir looms very, very high amongst the reasons for India-Pakistan discord. We should never forget that K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir. And yes, there are identity problems, but Kashmir is part of the identity problems. And also, if you step back, step away from India-Pakistan, you look at the whole of South Asia, everyone has identity problems vis-a-vis India. So identity problems are going to remain in all your smaller neighbors. There is no way you can wish them away. But yes, Kashmir has a centrality in the India-Pakistan discord which you cannot escape. We cannot rationalize it away that this is an instrument.
But then at 2611, what does it have to do with Jammu and Kashmir? How would Pakistan explain that?
I think 2611, there's no straightforward linear explanation.
Yeah.
I think it has a great deal to do with the position then the Pakistan army felt, the position it was taking on what was happening between India and Pakistan. I think there was a feeling amongst many Pakistani generals at that time that the India-Pakistan relationship is going in directions they did not want it to go. And the reason for that was there was a feeling that the Indians are now seriously prepared to reach a deal with Pakistan because they fear major instability after the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. I think the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, many people felt, had flipped a switch. And, the position of the Pakistan military,
He has a brief follow-up to you. Yeah.
Isn't it a bit more economic where Pakistan army uses this as an excuse to take all the goodies and all the businesses in Pakistan and hold it under themselves, take all the corner plots for the generals. That's such a famous, kind of statement.
It's true, but I would tend to, not give so much importance to this materialistic explanation. There is a ideological element to Kashmir which we shouldn't try to deny.
But
it is there for real, and it's going to remain. We have to live up to that.
But there have been, and I'll take that to Ambassador Sood, but also on the future of conflict, there's been a Musharraf attempting to cut a deal. There's been Bajwa more recently saying, you know what, we've got to save the economy of our country. We can't be obsessing about Kashmir. Has nothing shifted in Pakistan? Will nothing ever shift when it comes to the centrality of Kashmir as they see it, not as we see it clearly?
I think in addition to the identity, the identity question which Ajay flagged and the point that the deeper hostility that Raghavan mentioned, I would add a third element, which is what adds to the complexity of our relationship with Pakistan, and that is Pakistan's own domestic political structures. See, they've been distorted. They have had so many rounds of prolonged periods of military rule, and even today the military calls the shots. I mean, that's why Asif Munir is being entertained for lunch today at the White House. And there is no such precedent that one can think of readily. So, but what this has done is, how does the army maintain its hold on domestic politics? Okay. For the army to become not just the guardian of Pakistan's territorial frontiers, but also the guardian of Pakistan's ideology. No, in our case, it is our constitution, which is the guardian of India. Our military is there to defend our borders and guard our frontiers. How does Pakistan achieve this centrality in its domestic politics? It needs an enemy. So therefore, hostility with India is a key component for the Pakistan military to sustain itself in its central role. Now, you can turn around and say, well, how do we change it? Well, we can't. I mean, I don't think it is up to us or up to India to be able to change. It has to be for the Pakistani people. So, but you are in it for the long term because you're neighbors. Let me, on the nuclear thing, I agree with you completely. And I think the CDS, General Anil Chauhan, made a very interesting comment, you know, when he spoke at length on this on 31st of May at Singapore, at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He actually said both sides behaved very responsibly. So he was giving a responsibility, good certificate to the Pakistan military as well.
But he meant that it was calibrated.
It was calibrated. And you know, and he said that therefore, and this, we have seen this again and again, that whenever we've been at crisis points, the militaries have exercised a degree of responsibility and restraint, even as politicians have exercised loose rhetoric. So I think, but you're right, as long as the militaries continue to behave in that professional fashion, I don't think we will see that kind of a conflict. And by the way, the comment, a lot was made in Indian media about the speech that General Asim Munir made about Kashmir being the jugular. You know, I was checking it out historically. The first person who used this phrase was Jinnah.
Yeah, but that speech made more headlines for his emphasis on
Yes,
Hindu, Muslims,
but
and
Hindu,
there's nothing
and
in
the
common
two
with us.
nations.
Yeah.
But the fact that the Kashmir being the jugular, and as Raghavan reminded us, the K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir. Virtually, Nawaz Sharif, in his speech at the UN General Assembly in 2023, actually used the same sentence in the General Assembly.
Both the two-nation theory and Kashmir being jugular is Jinnah's
But
vocabulary.
are we really saying that Munir's speech was kind of normal for Pakistan? Because it didn't seem like other army chiefs.
Well, I think in hindsight, everybody interpreted it differently. But hindsight is always 100%.
We went to town on the speech.
Yeah.
But I think I said so in your program.
Yes.
That I didn't see anything that remarkable in it. It's something which is standard issue in
You
in
thought it was
Pakistan.
set piece Pakistan.
And just one more sentence. Finally, on Pahalgam,
Yes.
you're right, absolutely, which is what I said, deterrence by denial. But in the kind of headiness of Op Sindoor, we don't, if you notice that whole issue of whether there were any intelligence failures, whether there were any security lapses, that has all been brushed under, it is forgotten. The same happened with Pulwama.
Yeah.
But that is not how we build deterrence by denial. We have to learn from our mistakes.
I am told that we're out of time. Maybe I can just take one very quick last question if anybody has it. Just literally, it will have to be the last question to the young gentleman here.
I'm gonna actually ask the last question.
But can you give him, because he was going to get a chance here in the front.
Yeah, I'll give him and then I'm gonna ask the last question.
Yeah, that's fair.
Then we,
Yes.
Thank you. So my question is, how do you see India's foreign diplomacy in recent times, considering the fact that we have sort of lost out on our neighborhood alliances with, say, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, possibly to China? How do you see the current diplomacy playing out?
Anyone wants to take that before the last question?
Actually, I was going to just, maybe I can just follow up now, and it's a follow-up to this question. Did we lose the diplomatic war? We've now sent our diplomats on a sort of road trip, post that to sort of justify itself. But I don't believe that anyone actually came in and asked support, India's support, right after Pulwama attack. So how would you rate our role in international diplomacy of, consistently building consensus of our situation? And then I don't think we got the support internationally. At least that's kind of what people said.
Okay, so let me attempt the second question and then Ambassador Sood for the first one. I would say if this recent episode, if you try and unpack it, there were three aspects to it: the military, the diplomatic, and the communication, the strategic communication. I would say in military terms, it was an unqualified success. In diplomatic terms, it was also successful because India had support after Pahalgam to do what it had to do to counter terrorism almost universally. And once the operation started, there was no voice saying, why did you invade another country or violate the sovereignty of another country? The voices were only to say, please exercise restraint. But where I think we came up short was in the strategic communication. The communication was still better than it was 6 years ago in terms of, tweeting about it at 1:44 a.m. rather than waiting for the Pakistanis to say that they've been attacked. But I think the strategic communication, we should be back on the drawing board to see how we can do way better. Because Pakistan had the advantage of the first lie. And today's day and age, the first lie sticks. And, we had to be understanding how to populate our electronic channels with facts rather than them grabbing fiction from social media and using it. So there's a great deal of learning there that we need to do.
Yeah.
Well, in my view, we did something which had to be done. It was forced on us. As I said, it was choosing from a menu of bad options. There's nothing to be triumphalist about. We have emerged from a very dangerous situation. And you don't even know what is going to happen next. Yeah. So I think triumphalism is the last thing we need. And there's enough of it both in India and in Pakistan to be on the guard, on our guard against it. Let's not forget that Pakistan is also proclaiming victory every day. But the larger point is what was raised about diplomacy in South Asia. And there, I think, if you look at diplomacy in a longer term, there is clearly a major problem. That while you have done some very significant things on a wider regional and international level, in South Asia itself, you have not been able to provide the kind of lead which is expected from a country of our size and our potential and our power. Because there is a total absence of any regional cooperation mechanism. Your relations in with Bangladesh, the situation in Myanmar, the situation with Nepal to a great extent, forget about Pakistan. I think they're all very, very problematic. And I do think that regardless of what we put out as slogans, we need to focus much more on our neighbors and be less narcissistic about how we approach them.
Well, let me start with the neighborhood. First of all our neighbors are far, far smaller in size, and they are, in a sense, countries like Nepal and Bhutan are landlocked. They depend on us for access and all of that. And then the other thing is that we share ethnicities across the border. Tamils, Sri Lanka, Tamil Nadu, Bengalis on this side, Bangladesh. Nepal, the whole Madhesi, this thing. Pakistan is a separate category. Let's not even go down that route. So this means that the neighborhood, investment in diplomacy in neighborhood is not going to give you the same rate of return as investment in diplomacy with major powers in Europe or elsewhere. However, the fundamental principle is that if you cannot be, अगर आप अपने मोहल्ले के चौधरी नहीं हैं, तो आप शहर के कोतवाल नहीं बन सकते. I hope everybody understands that. Okay. So, so it is an investment that you have to make for your larger strategic objectives, not in terms of merely saying that, oh, I give this concession to Bangladesh or I give this concession to Sri Lanka, so they must reciprocate. I mean, if you've seen some of the recent tit for tat that's going on with Bangladesh, that's the point that I'm making. You have to look at it in terms of the investment in the interests of the larger objective. About diplomacy, I mean, we've spoken so much about hyphenation. I mean, imagine if you were the foreign minister in Germany. I mean, just taking Germany as an example, we could take any of the others. And today you receive the Indian delegation with half a dozen members of parliament and so on. And the next day you receive a Pakistani delegation. Are you not going to hyphenate it? Yes or no? So, but that's the whole point. So hyphenation, we can't get away from, but making it equal is what we need to get away from. And that requires a different level of engagement and diplomacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been a kind of masterclass in learning. Let's have a big round of applause for our three distinguished guests. It's been an excellent conversation and you've been an excellent audience, so thank you so much.